"Get off my property before I make you regret walking onto it," Bryce Vale says, loud enough that 3 houses hear him. He drops a pair of sparring gloves in the grass and waits, chin up, shoulders squared, the posture of a young man who has never once lost in front of an audience. Elijah Marsh does not look at the gloves. He looks at Bryce's hands, the way they hang loose and ready, the way his weight has already shifted onto the balls of his feet. Nobody on Cedar Hollow Lane has ever seen Elijah Marsh raise his voice. Nobody has ever seen him flinch either. That should have told them something. Elijah Marsh is 44 years old. He stands 6'1", with a scar along his left eyebrow that people assume came from a bar fight and never ask about, because Elijah has a way of ending conversations gently before they start. He is a master electrician, licensed in 3 states, the kind of man who shows up on time, quotes a fair price, and leaves a job site cleaner than he found it. He raises his daughter Zoe alone. She is 15, sharp-tongued, quick to laugh, and she has her mother's exact eyes, which is a fact Elijah notices every single morning and never says out loud. Renee Marsh died 4 years ago on a Tuesday in October on Route 9 when a delivery truck ran a red light at 6:52 in the evening. Zoe was 11. Elijah was 30 minutes away on a job in Fairview, wiring a kitchen renovation, and he has never fully forgiven the 30 minutes since. He sold the house they'd bought together because he couldn't walk past the room they'd painted for a second child they never had, and he moved 4 miles across town to Cedar Hollow Lane into a smaller house with a bigger yard because Zoe said she wanted somewhere she could plant things. He works 6 days a week. He coaches Zoe's travel soccer team on the 7th. He has $41,300 in a savings account he does not touch, because it is the number Renee once told him would mean Zoe could go to any college she wanted without a loan attached to her name, and Elijah has been chasing that number every year since she died. What the neighbors do not know, because Elijah has never once mentioned it, is that he spent 16 years in the United States Navy, the last 9 of them assigned to naval special warfare, attached to a SEAL platoon that does not appear in any recruiting commercial. He led men through deployments in places that were never named in the news, made decisions in rooms where the wrong call cost lives, and came home the last time with a Bronze Star in a drawer he has opened exactly twice since separating from the service. He does not talk about it, not because he was told not to, not entirely, but because Renee asked him for something in the last year of her life that he has held on to like scripture ever since. She told him she didn't want their daughter to grow up measuring her father by the things he'd survived. She wanted Zoe to know him as steady, as present, as a man who fixes what's broken and comes home for dinner. Elijah took that request and, in his grief, folded it into something harder and more absolute than Renee likely intended. No war stories, no explanations, no version of himself that could be mistaken for dangerous. Preston Vale moves into the house next door on a Saturday in April with a moving crew of 6 and a landscaping truck idling at the curb before the boxes are even unloaded. Preston is 51, a real estate developer who has built a reputation and a fortune on buying distressed parcels along the river corridor and turning them into gated communities with names like Somerset Ridge and the Enclave at Millbrook. He shakes Elijah's hand over the fence within the hour, tells him it's good to have a tradesman on the block, someone who can be useful, and laughs at his own joke before Elijah can decide whether to be offended. His son Bryce is 22, 6'3", 215 pounds, and holds a second-degree black belt in Taekwondo, along with a growing record in regional MMA circuits, 4 wins and 0 losses. Sponsored in a small but real way by a supplement company called Apex Forge that has started sending him branded gear and mentioning him on their page. Bryce is talented, genuinely talented, the kind of fighter who has put in the hours and has the technical foundation to prove it. What he does not have, and what Elijah recognizes within the first 2 weeks of watching him train in the driveway at odd hours, is any idea what to do with anger that has nowhere to land once the cage door opens and there's no opponent left to hit. Preston built that anger into him early, the way some fathers build discipline and others build a wound shaped like discipline. A Vale does not lose. A Vale does not apologize. Elijah has heard Preston say both phrases to his son within earshot of the fence line, and something in him tightens each time, though he tells himself it isn't his business. The first real friction comes on a Wednesday afternoon in May. Zoe is in the driveway with her bike upside down, patching a tire, headphones in, when Bryce walks over from his side of the property and kicks the bike hard enough to send it skidding across the concrete. He tells her the rubber smell is drifting into his workout space and messing with his breathing during his sprint sets. When she tells him to back off, he grabs her water bottle off the ground and empties it into the gutter, then tells her she should learn to keep her things where they belong before somebody teaches her the hard way. Elijah is on the porch. He crosses the yard without hurrying, picks up the bike, sets it upright, and puts himself between his daughter and the young man twice her size. He does not raise his voice. Apologize to her. Don't come onto this side of the property line again, he says, and it comes out level, almost gentle, which Bryce reads as weakness rather than what it actually is, which is a man choosing every single word on purpose. Bryce steps in close, the way he steps into an opponent before a clock starts, and tells Elijah that a man who spends his life wiring other people's houses has no business giving orders to somebody who could put him on the ground in 4 seconds. Elijah says nothing. He stands there until Bryce, reading the stillness as fear, laughs and walks away with his phone already out, already narrating the exchange to somebody on a video call. That night, Zoe starts a folder on her phone. She does not tell her father about it. The tension escalates through June in small, deniable increments, each one worse than the last, the way pressure always builds when one side keeps absorbing it without consequence. Bryce lets his dog into the marsh yard twice, both times while Elijah's tomato beds are freshly turned, and both times feigns innocence about the leash. He mocks Elijah's truck, a 2016 Ford F-250 with 118,000 miles on it, parked beside Preston's matched pair of Range Rovers, loud enough for Zoe's friends to hear when they're over for a study session. He tells a group of them, unprompted, that some men work with their hands their whole lives and call it pride when it's really just the ceiling they were born under. Zoe hears it through the window. She says nothing to her father. She adds the audio to her folder instead because Cody Reyes, a junior at her school with a habit of recording everything, was sitting on the porch steps with his phone already up. The turn that changes the shape of everything happens at the property line in late June. On a Sunday evening while Preston is watering a bed of hydrangeas he's overpaying a landscaper to maintain. He makes conversation the easy testing way certain men do, gauging how much the person across the fence actually knows, and mentions almost as an aside that his firm is dealing with an inconvenience tied to a zoning application for a 62-unit development along Miller's Creek. Something about an architectural review board holding up the permit over a stormwater variance that Preston calls dismissively bureaucratic theater. Elijah's expression does not change, but something behind it locks into place because he sits on that exact review board, appointed 18 months ago by the county commission, specifically for his engineering background and his reputation for not being purchasable, and he has already flagged Vale Development's Miller's Creek proposal twice for a drainage plan that would flood 3 downstream properties during any storm heavier than a 2-year event. He has never mentioned his position on the board to anyone on Cedar Hollow Lane. He didn't think it was relevant to being a neighbor. Preston catches something in the half-second pause before Elijah answers, not enough to be certain of anything, but enough to file away and worry over later. From that point forward, Preston's approach shifts in ways he never states outright. He understands, because men like Preston understand these mechanics instinctively, that if the review board member blocking his permit could be provoked into a documented act of aggression, a police report, a viral video, anything that painted him as unstable or dangerous, his objections could be reframed as personal animus rather than sound engineering judgment. The board could be pressured to disregard his findings. The permit could move. Preston does not need Elijah to disappear from the neighborhood. He needs Elijah to make one mistake, in public, on record, And he has a son with an untethered temper and a growing sense of entitlement already primed to help him get there. He starts feeding Bryce small permissions, mentioning which complaints about the Marsh house he finds reasonable, staying conspicuously silent when things escalate, letting his son understand without ever saying it directly that whatever happens next will be managed, contained, made to disappear, the way inconvenient things always disappear for people who write checks the size Preston writes. The breaking point arrives on the 4th of July, at the block's annual cookout on the shared green at the end of the cul-de-sac, the one event every family on Cedar Hollow Lane turns out for. Elijah brings Zoe, hoping for one uncomplicated afternoon. For the first hour, that's almost what they get. Zoe laughs with friends near the dessert table. Elijah talks fence posts with a neighbor, positions himself, out of decades of habit rather than any conscious decision, near the edge of the gathering with a clear sightline to the parking area. He lets himself relax into it. Then Preston arrives with a cooler of imported beer and more energy than the moment requires, and Bryce walks in behind him already carrying sparring gloves, 3 friends from his gym trailing in a loose formation, phones already angled up, like they're expecting something worth capturing. The crowd feels the shift before it understands it. Bryce crosses the grass straight toward Elijah and throws the gloves down at his feet, loud enough that half the gathering turns to look. He announces that today they're going to settle things properly, in the open, so there's no question left about who runs this street. His friends lift their phones higher. A few people near the grill step back without quite deciding to. Elijah does not reach for the gloves. He steps sideways instead, placing himself between Bryce and the table where Zoe is standing, and says the only thing that matters: "I'm not fighting you. Step back from my daughter." Bryce laughs, the performance version, built for the phones rather than for himself, and keeps going. He says something cruel about Renee, a woman he never met, and tells Zoe she deserves a father willing to defend his name instead of hiding behind stillness that accomplishes nothing. "You want to grow up thinking hiding is strength," he says, loud enough for the whole green to hear. "That's the lesson you're learning right now, watching him do nothing." Preston stands beside his son through all of it, arms crossed, saying nothing to stop him, which is its own kind of statement. Zoe tugs her father's sleeve and asks him quietly, "Please, not to do this." Her voice is smaller than usual, and it tightens something in Elijah's chest, harder than anything Bryce has said. Holding the same instinct that has guided him for 4 years, Elijah turns to walk his daughter away from the green entirely. He reads the situation the way he's read every situation since Renee died. Leaving is the safest thing he can do for her right now. Bryce reads the turn as surrender, and surrender in front of this many cameras, with his sponsor's name trending on his profile, is not something his pride can absorb. He steps forward and grabs Zoe's arm to block her father's path, and the motion sends her stumbling hard onto the pavement edge of the green, opening a scrape across her palm deep enough to draw blood immediately. Everything Elijah has held in careful storage for 4 years comes apart in that instant. He crosses back, checks his daughter's hand, hands her off to a neighbor already moving to help, and turns fully around to face Bryce with nothing left to manage. He gives him one last chance, delivered low and even. "Apologize to her. Leave. This ends right here if you walk away now." Bryce pulls his gloves on and glances back to confirm the phones are still rolling. He tells Elijah he's going to make sure Zoe watches her father carried off this grass, so everyone on Cedar Hollow Lane finally understands which family actually matters here. What follows lasts under 90 seconds, and every person on that green will describe it differently for months afterward, because none of them have ever watched anyone move the way Elijah Marsh moves once he stops holding back. Bryce opens with a fast combination, hands quick and well-trained from 1,000 rounds of sparring. Elijah slips the first strike and uses Bryce's own forward momentum to send him stumbling into the grass. A few people laugh before catching themselves, and that sound damages Bryce's composure more than the fall did. He resets, comes back with a spinning kick that has shown up in his highlight reel more than once, and Elijah reads the windup, closes the distance before the kick extends, and drops him a second time, though not before the kick connects partway across his shoulder, a glancing blow that staggers him half a step and pulls a sharp breath from the crowd. Nobody laughs after that. It is plain to everyone watching that this is not a clean, one-sided demonstration. Elijah asks him to stay down. He has not thrown a single punch of his own. For a few seconds Bryce holds still in the grass, chest heaving, something crossing his face that looks like the first real recognition of how badly he has misjudged this. Then he looks past Elijah toward his father, and whatever doubt was forming closes back up, because Preston is shouting from the sideline, telling him to get up, to finish it, feeding him exactly enough pressure to override what little self-preservation he has left. Bryce surges up into a full takedown attempt, and Elijah drops his hips, turns into the momentum instead of against it, and takes him face down into the grass, in a hold that pins both arms completely. Bryce thrashes, panic finally entering his voice, and Elijah keeps his grip controlled, tells him quietly to tap, that there's nothing left to win from this position. When Bryce refuses out of pride rather than any real hope of escape, Preston lunges across the grass, knocking a folding chair sideways, and in the scramble, Bryce's free hand finds a length of rebar left leaning against a nearby fence post from an unfinished repair job, and swings it wildly toward Elijah's head. It misses by less than a foot and keeps traveling in its arc toward Zoe, who has broken away from the neighbor holding her and run back toward her father the moment the shouting turned frantic. There is nothing left to weigh. Elijah shoves his daughter clear with one arm and strips the rebar from Bryce's hand in the same motion, sending it spinning well away from both of them, then drives him face down and locks his arms behind his back so completely he cannot move an inch. Something changes in Elijah's voice as he does it, dropping into a register that has nothing left of the quiet neighbor who fixes gutters and waves from his porch every morning. It is flat, precise, and entirely certain of itself, the voice of a man who once gave orders in places where hesitation was measured in lives. Standing at the edge of the crowd is a man named Harold Whitfield, 71 years old, a retired two-star general visiting his daughter 2 streets over for the holiday weekend. Whitfield does not need a technique demonstration to understand exactly what he is looking at. He steps through the gathered neighbors until he can see Elijah's face clearly, and says the only thing that needs saying, "Chief Marsh, I did not expect to see you at a neighborhood cookout." Nobody speaks for a long moment. Bryce, still pinned beneath a man he genuinely believed he could beat, understands in that instant how completely he has misjudged every single thing since the afternoon he first crossed the property line. Whitfield had reviewed after-action reports with Elijah's name on them years earlier, had sat across secure tables from him in rooms that neither man will ever publicly describe, and recognizes his face as clearly as he recognizes anything from that chapter of his own service. Elijah releases Bryce's wrists, checks that both shoulders still move freely, and steps back, aware of every eye on the green, aware that 4 years of careful distance have come apart in the space of one afternoon, and there is no folder anywhere that is going to put it back together. Preston calls the police within minutes, describing an unprovoked assault by a former military man against his unarmed son. When the first officer arrives, he moves toward Elijah first, even with the rebar lying in plain view 8 feet from where Bryce is still catching his breath. A neighbor named Carol Diaz, who has lived on Cedar Hollow Lane for 18 years, says clearly enough for the officer to hear that the man who just shoved his own daughter out of the path of a swung rebar should not be the first person asked to get on the ground. The officer hesitates, looking between the rebar, Bryce, and Elijah standing with both hands visible, and his voice even, and the version of events Preston has already been constructing over the phone, slows down just enough to be questioned. Carol has video from her own porch camera. Cody Reyes, the junior with the habit of recording everything, has footage from the moment Bryce threw the gloves down. The footage shows the specific threats, the grab, the reach for the rebar. By the time statements are finished, it is Bryce, not Elijah, facing a potential charge for assault with a weapon. Preston pays within the week to have the footage edited down before any of it can spread on its own terms, cutting every frame that shows his son reaching for the rebar, releasing what remains under a headline built for outrage, Former Navy SEAL attacks unarmed young athlete without provocation at neighborhood party. The clip moves faster than anyone in the Marsh household anticipates. Zoe walks into second period 2 days later to find 3 phones already angled toward her before she reaches her seat, a classmate asking, not unkindly but without much gentleness either, whether it's true her dad had some kind of breakdown at a barbecue. She says nothing, sits down, and gets through the day the way she gets through most hard things, by keeping her face still and waiting for the hours to pass. She does not tell her father what the hallways were like that night. A caseworker from Child Protective Services arrives on a Tuesday afternoon, polite and methodical, explaining that an anonymous complaint raised concerns about violence in the home and that she is required to follow up regardless of the circumstances around the video. She speaks with Zoe alone in the living room while Elijah waits in the kitchen, forcing himself to stay seated. When she finds him afterward, she tells him Zoe was consistent, clear, and that nothing in the home concerns her, though the file will remain open pending a standard follow-up visit. Elijah answers every question she has without raising his voice, lets her walk the house, and stands at the kitchen window a long time after she leaves, thinking about how many years he has spent believing that sealing everything away was the same thing as keeping his daughter safe from it. To clear his name and protect his seat on the review board, which Preston is now actively lobbying county commissioners to strip from him on the grounds that a man caught on video attacking a young athlete has no business serving as an impartial reviewer of anything, Elijah faces a choice. Defending himself properly means unsealing part of a service record he has kept locked away since Renee died, a record he has spent 4 years keeping as far from Zoe's daily life as possible. He sits at his desk one night with the drawer open in front of him, reading commendations written in language that feels like it describes someone else entirely, and closes it again without deciding anything, though some part of him already understands which way this is going. Zoe finds out about the CPS complaint before he tells her, having overheard enough of a phone call between him and his attorney to fill in the rest. She sits across from him at the kitchen table that evening, her bandaged hand in her lap, and says what she has been holding on to for weeks. If you hadn't kept everything hidden for so long, she tells him, maybe people would have known who you actually are from the start. Maybe Bryce never pushes this far if the whole street already understood what you survived to come home to us. Elijah doesn't have a ready answer for that, which is its own kind of answer. He thinks about what Renee actually asked him for at the end, and about the difference between what she meant and what he built in her name, and for the first time those two things do not look identical from where he's sitting. He reaches across the table and tells her the truth as plainly as he can manage. No drawer standing between them this time. He tells disappear behind his own silence. She wanted Zoe to know him as more than whatever the service had shaped him into, and somewhere along the way his grief had turned that request into a wall instead of a door his daughter could walk through when she needed him. Zoe doesn't have a full answer ready either. She nods slowly, the way a person does when they are still deciding how much forgiveness is available and in what form, and she reaches over and rests her uninjured hand briefly on top of his before pulling it back. The quiet between them that night feels different from every quiet that came before it. The zoning fight resolves faster than either of them expects, and it resolves because of a document Elijah has been sitting on for 3 weeks without fully understanding its weight. Preston's engineering firm, in its rush to push the Millers Creek permit through before the review board's next session, submitted a revised stormwater study that Elijah, reviewing it line by line one evening after Zoe goes to bed, recognizes as containing falsified soil percolation data, numbers copied nearly verbatim from an unrelated site 11 miles away, submitted under the stamp of an engineer whose license, it turns out, lapsed 9 months earlier. Elijah does not sign anything himself. He forwards the discrepancy through proper channels to the county's chief engineer and recuses himself from any further vote on the Vale development application, unwilling to let his own name anywhere near a decision that could look like retaliation, even a correct one. An independent audit confirms the falsification within 11 days. Vale development is suspended from the county's approved contractor list pending investigation, the Millers Creek permit denied outright, and the state licensing board opens its own inquiry into the engineer whose stamp was used without current authorization. Preston's response is not to step back. He escalates, calling in every connection he has, pushing to have Elijah removed from the review board entirely on the grounds that a man who assaulted his son at a family cookout has no business serving as a neutral evaluator of anything. The complaint eventually reaches General Whitfield, who still consults for the county on infrastructure oversight matters, though Preston has no idea Whitfield was standing 15 feet away on that green and watched the entire sequence unfold from the start. Whitfield lets Preston finish his entire account without interrupting, listens to the description of Elijah as unstable and dangerous, listens to the mention of donors and commissioners, and a willingness to escalate as high as necessary, then tells him, in a tone that gives away nothing about how far past appropriate the conversation has already gone, that the man he wants removed is among the most decorated chiefs who ever served under his command, that he was present for the incident being described, and that the conduct Preston himself has just described, attempting to pressure a sitting review board member during an active licensing investigation, carries its own legal exposure, entirely separate from anything involving his son. The full, unedited footage reaches a local investigative reporter within days, delivered by Zoe herself, who has spent weeks quietly compiling screenshots of messages Bryce sent to other kids on the block, older posts mocking people smaller than him, and the complete cookout video that Cody had backed up in a location Preston's people never thought to check. The reporter runs the story alongside the falsified stormwater report, laying out a pattern that makes the cookout look less like an isolated incident and more like the visible edge of something Preston had been managing quietly for years. Bryce is charged with assault with a deadly weapon and accepts a plea agreement carrying probation, community service, and a mandatory anger management program. His gym owner, a man named Terrence Wu, who has built his reputation on discipline as much as technique, plays the unedited footage for his full training staff, strips Bryce's black belt, and bans him from the facility permanently, telling him in front of every younger fighter who once looked up to him that a martial artist who uses his training to threaten a 15-year-old girl has already failed the only evaluation that actually matters in that gym. Apex Forge withdraws its sponsorship within the week without a public statement, quietly scrubbing his name from its platforms. The friends who filmed him that afternoon stop returning his calls. The CPS file closes without further action, the caseworker calling personally to let Elijah know she rarely sees a case resolved this cleanly and hopes the rest of his year is considerably quieter than his summer has been. Preston's board of directors, facing an active state investigation and a county contractor suspension that has already cost the firm 2 other pending projects, forces his resignation within 2 months, a total loss the company later discloses at $7,400,000 in canceled contracts and legal fees. His name comes off the building he broke ground on 18 months earlier. A year later, the review board Elijah still serves on has implemented a new independent verification requirement for all stormwater submissions, a policy now referred to informally around the county offices as the Marsh Standard, credited with catching 2 additional falsified filings before they ever reached a vote. Elijah has taken on 2 apprentices through a trade mentorship program he started that spring, both of them teenagers from households not unlike the one he grew up in, and the program has since placed 11 young people into paid electrical apprenticeships with local contractors. Zoe, now 16, has grown quieter in some ways, and louder in others. She speaks at her school's assembly that spring about what it means to stop mistaking silence for safety, and 3 separate students come up to her afterward to say it was the first time anyone had put words to something they'd been carrying too. The $41,300 savings account Elijah built in Renee's memory has grown past $58,000, and, for the first time, he lets himself imagine spending some of it on something other than a distant, hypothetical tuition bill, a family trip to the coast Zoe has been asking about since she was 12. On a late afternoon in October, with the moving trucks already loaded in the Vale driveway and the for sale sign staked back into the yard, Bryce appears at the fence line without gloves and without anyone behind him. He looks younger than he has all year, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, nothing left to perform for an audience that isn't there anymore. Elijah sets down the shears he's been using along the fence and walks over without hurrying. Bryce asks him, in a voice smaller than anything he used that whole summer, why Elijah never broke his arm that day on the grass when he clearly could have. I'd already won by then, Elijah tells him. Bryce doesn't understand it right away. He looks past Elijah toward where Zoe is kneeling a few feet back in the dirt, a trowel in her hand, and something slow moves across his face. The beginning of understanding that Elijah was never talking about the fight at all. He nods once and walks back toward the driveway without another word. Elijah kneels back down beside his daughter in the dirt, where they are replanting a row of hydrangeas Bryce had kicked apart back in June, the roots bruised but mostly intact, more life still in the ground than either of them expected when they first pulled the broken stems clear. Zoe presses a trowel into the soil and asks her father, without looking up, whether fighting that day meant breaking the promise he made her mother. Elijah thinks about it honestly before answering. He tells her he didn't fight to prove he was stronger than anyone. He did what was necessary to keep her safe, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, he finally understood the difference between those two things, a difference he should have seen a long time before he did. Zoe presses her palm flat against the soil beside the roots they've just covered and tells him she doesn't need a perfect father, she just needs one who stops hiding things from her. Elijah doesn't have a speech ready for that. He nods the kind of nod that carries more between two people than most things said out loud, and they stay in the dirt until the light goes flat and the street grows quiet around them, two hands in the same patch of ground, new growth already pushing up through the damaged stems, quietly, the way most real change tends to happen. What does real strength look like in your own life? If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes good fathers are out there, quietly holding everything together, and tell us in the comments which moment stayed with you longest.